we are now facing a situation where there's almost a shadow cabinet that's being developed, and it's thwarting the authority of the United States Congress. These czars in the various positions, you know, we have Secretary of Health and Human Services, but yet we have a healthcare czar who's not subject to being called before the United States Senate to testify. We can't compel her to come up here and testify. We, because they're not part of the confirmation process, they also are, because the administration claims, you know, about this executive privilege, their communication. So we have somebody with tremendous power and yet is not subject to the confirmation process. And I think that this is something that the Congress, whether we have a Republican president or a Democrat president, we've got to get a handle on. It started slipping in there with a czar here and a czar there, but it's completely out of control now. And this committee at least has should assert its authority, saying that a healthcare czar ought to be part of the Senate confirmation process. And so, Mr. Chairman, earlier this year, President Obama even said, "My administration will take appropriate action consistent with law and policy to disclose information rapidly in forms that the public can readily find and use." Well, part of that information is having, you know, people from the administration come here, you know, and testify. And this is once again about sunshine. This is about letting light in and open government. And if we have administrations trying to get around, because of the use of executive privilege, trying to get around the balance of powers between the administration and the legislative branch, I think that it's out of line. President Obama has created 18 new czars. These are political appointees with broad powers to create, coordinate policy, and once again, they are not accountable.
Could we be in order, please, so we can hear the Senator from Nevada?
Thank you.
It's off too many side conversations.
Appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. According to Article 2 of the Constitution, the President is empowered in relevant part to, quote, nominate and by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, public ministers, consuls, judges of the Supreme Court, and all other officers of the United States, whose appointments are not herein otherwise provided for, and which shall be established by law. So we clearly have the authority to do this. And I think that it is really important. Once again, this is not a question of going after a Democrat president. We probably should have done this. We probably should have gotten together and done this before. It's just that it's gotten 18 new ones on top of the ones that were already there. It's just getting out of hand. And I think that we as the Congress need to say to the President, we're not allowing this anymore. We're going to take back the power that is rightfully in the legislative branch, because the balance of powers is getting out of balance. And the Constitution clearly outlined, to keep that balance of power, we need to step up and do the right thing. And that's what this amendment is really stating.
Senator, I have a question to ask. I'm a little unclear what you have in mind and what this amendment covers. The description I have, the amendment would require that czars be subject to Senate confirmation. Does this mean that all czars?
No, this actually says any czar handling health care issues.
Oh,
so it's under the...
that must be a modification.
Yeah,
okay.
Sorry, yes.
And that would be this committee's jurisdiction?
Yes.
The problem I have with this fundamentally is the job title czar does not exist. That is, those are not officers. Those are not...
This is a...
I'm sorry, Senator, I have the floor.
Sorry.
That these are not officers established by law. And any administration can informally designate any name for any person not established by law. Cabinet secretaries are established by law, assistant secretaries, etc. For example, administration could say this is the chief, This is the superintendent. I mean, this is the captain. This is the, we can think of all kinds of examples, and that they're not established by law. They're just designated by the administration. And we already in this committee, I dare say, about 40 different officers established by law appear before this committee for Senate confirmation, and those are not all health. Those are not all health. I'm talking about tax and health and so forth. But the HHS secretary clearly does appear before this committee for Senate confirmation, as do the assistant secretaries. And I think this committee has a pretty good handle on the confirmation process for those officers that are established by law and named by law to be subject to Senate confirmation.
Well, Mr. Chairman,
but it doesn't make much. I have a hard time, frankly, coming to the conclusion that this Senate should require a confirmation process. Congress should require a confirmation process of people within the administration that are not have job titles not established by law.
Mr. Chairman, we have a conceptual mark before us. That conceptual mark, we all know what we're talking about here as far as czars are concerned. Everybody calls them czars. I mean, we know who the czars are. So as a conceptual, we can come up with the legal language when the actual drafting of the amendment, when we get to the legal language, but we all know what that is. We cannot call Nancy up here. Okay, we cannot compel her to testify right now. She has broad powers. Most of these czars are not confirmed today. They should be confirmed. If they have broad powers, this is a question of balance of powers. This is not a shot at the administration. This is a question of any administration that the Congress should take back its power under the Constitution on this balance of powers. If we don't step up, you can get more and more power concentrated in the administration. And that, I believe, is something that we shouldn't do. We should, as the Senate, stand up and say, this is rightful under the Constitution for us to have the advice and consent clause and to be able to compel folks to testify. If they're under the advice and consent clause, they cannot, refuse to testify up here.
Well, I might say, too, that, first of all, I totally agree with transparency. I mean, this whole process is probably the most transparent legislative process this Congress has seen as we're trying to pass health care legislation. I mean, no legislative process has been more transparent than the one we've undertaken here in our committee. And I want every cabinet secretary, assistant secretary that's relevant to this committee's jurisdiction to come up and testify, and when we call them, they do. Now, we could go down the administration, I don't know what the book is, the executive directory, whatever it is, and look for somebody like Nancy Ann Vindeparle and say, well, she's the czar, so we'll make her subject to Senate confirmation. Well, let's say we do that. What's the next step? The next step is, and all administrations do this, Republican and Democrat, they'll say, okay, fine, we'll get somebody else who's sort of the president's private advisor on health care matters that is not subject to Senate confirmation. They'll accomplish it with somebody else the purpose that they all pursue, and it gets close to executive privilege. It gets close to a separation of powers issues between the Congress and the executive branch, and I think that we'd be wasting our time to try to track down every czar or czar-like person in administration and say that person's subject to Senate confirmation. We should rather spend our time, frankly, working with great people we have now that are subject to Senate confirmation we can bring up here, and also just talking informally to Nancy Ann. I mean, she's given us lots of good information, and she's good to work with, but I don't know that having her testify here would really advance the cause of health care reform.
With all due respect, Mr. Chairman, I don't believe that it's a waste of time for the Congress to assert its authority in this idea of there's a constant struggle between the branches of government. There's a constant struggle between the judiciary, the Congress, and the President. There has throughout the history of our country. And if you don't fight for each branches of power, you can get more and more power concentrated into that branch. And that is the reason that our founders even set up this idea of separation of powers and splitting of the powers. But they didn't want all the power concentrated, or too much power concentrated, in the executive branch, in the legislative branch, or the judicial branch.
Max,
This is a way for the administration to skirt that balance of power. And if they are doing it, and we aren't asserting our authority, then we're allowing them to get away with it.
Mr. Chairman.
That's why this is worth the fight.